Anyway, so this is part 2 of my So You Want to Be a Tuner video series. And last time we spoke about ride height, and now we're going to be talking, still within suspension, we're going to be talking about spring rate. So what do you need to know? Well, obviously the spring rate, as is suggested by the name, has to do with the springs in your car. Now this could be a variety of things depending on the age of the car. If it's an older car, it'll probably be leaf springs, which are long beam-shaped springs which take up the load of the vehicle, or it could be on newer vehicles or some old vehicles, but generally newer vehicles, a coil spring, which is what you'd imagine it as being. It's just a coiled spring attached to the bottom section of the wheel and the bodywork, obviously inside the wheel arch, which allows the cushioning, as we mentioned before, of drive. Now, what is spring rate? Well, spring rate is the softness or stiffness of said springs. So what do you need to know about that? What are the advantages and disadvantages of going soft, medium, hard, whatever? Well, on older vehicles, such as muscle cars, classics in general, the suspension is typically quite soft, which is why when you see an old car taking a corner at high speed, they tend to wallow around in corners quite a bit. They sway around a lot under acceleration and braking, and also, especially on vehicles with, or on classic vehicles with more power, like muscle cars, when that weight transfer happens because of having soft springs, the weight transfer happens in such a way so that some of your tractive force weight is taken off of the drive wheels, which in the case of a muscle car is the rear wheels, and that results in you losing grip. And that is what causes a muscle car to start to drift, because you've lost all the weight grounding the back of the car, so it's allowing the rear wheels to start to spin, and this ultimately transfers into drifting, which, although looks good, it's, as you'd expect, slower. So when would you want to have soft springs? Well, soft springs in real life are obviously good for comfort because they absorb more of the road noise, as it were. But on a game, you would very rarely really want soft springs. The only circumstances where you'd really want that are in rallying, to take up the impacts of jumping over, big jumps or taking corners at high speed, or possibly in drag racing, particularly with muscle cars, because as we mentioned in the last video about the car bottoming out, having soft springs allows you to more smoothly transfer that weight transfer to the rear wheels without affecting the car's acceleration. So in other words, if the rear suspension can take up the G-force, the lateral G's of accelerating away off the line, you won't lose so much time of having the rear end bounce. Now, you won't be able to physically see the rear end bounce, but softening up the suspension will reduce that bouncing effect, which equates into more acceleration. But what about for cornering? Because as we mentioned, older cars with soft suspension tend to wallow around corners. Well, that, if you're designing a car for corners, or tuning a car for corners, you want to go the opposite way. You want to stiffen up the springs. What are the advantages and disadvantages? Well, the advantage is that a stiffer spring will not travel as far as a soft spring, so it won't compress and extend as much. The advantage of this is it means that the car cannot physically move around as much as if it had soft springs. This results in a more flat cornering line without swaying, and it also means that you're not losing grip as you would be if the car was lifting. There's less chance of lifting a wheel off the ground completely, which obviously is a complete waste of time when you're trying to get around a corner as quickly as possible. And it also helps to lower the car's centre of gravity and works hand in hand with lowering the suspension. So that's about all you really need to know about spring rate, really. It's fairly simple. Obviously, you can get more complicated in real life, but on games, that's about as complicated as it gets. So next we will consider dampers. Now dampers are what work hand in hand with springs. So commonly on a car, if you've ever had the chance to see in a car's wheel well with the wheel removed, you'll see a spring coiled around a cylinder. And that cylinder is the damper. Now it doesn't always look that way, but that's the general layout. A damper with a coil around it. So what does the damper do? Well, the damper acts to, as the name suggests, dampen the springs. So if you were to have a car with no dampers at all, only springs, the result is that when you brake, for instance, to stop for the lights or whatever, the car would be bouncing around all over the place violently. Not just swaying like an old American car, but actually violently juddering along. So the dampers act as kind of a team with the springs, so that the springs take most of the load, but the dampers keep the springs within comfortable limits. So, excuse me. So there are two main aspects of dampers that you need to know within gaming: the compression and the extension. Now compression, as you may guess, is when you compress the damper, so when the car's body goes down, such as after you've landed from a jump, or if you turn into a corner, the damper will be compressed by the car's weight transferring onto it, or when you accelerate it will be transferred onto the rear, etc. Now the compression is that. The extension is the force within that damper that's been set to bring it back up to the normal ride height again. So kind of like the rebound. Well, it is the rebound. What I'm saying is kind of like the rebound. So what do you need to know about that? Well, for compression, again, it needs to work hand in hand with your ride height and your spring rate. But as a general rule, the principles are the same. So if you want a drag car, you'll probably want it quite soft at the back to take up the drive without wasting time juddering the back end along. Whereas for instance, rallying, you'll probably want quite a soft compression ratio so that suspension will go down, but then you don't want the car to carry on bouncing for ages because that wastes time. So if you have a soft compression ratio so that the car can take up the weight of the car slamming on the ground, and then a stiffer rebound, that means the car will go down easily, but then will slowly come up to its normal ride height, instead of just continually bouncing on and on and on, wasting time. So I'll leave it there for this video. It's kind of gone over the time I wanted it to be, but yeah, so next time we'll discuss anti-roll bars, and again, I'd appreciate feedback. Did you find this helpful? And as always, thanks for watching.